Mark 3. The anger of the shepherd. Rain beats a steady rhythm against the living room window panes as the small group tightens their circle around the low wooden coffee table. Austin taps his open notebook against his knee, looking at the passage where Jesus heals on the Sabbath, while Samuel and Sarah trace the verses with visibly tense expressions. Look at the progression here from chapter 2 into chapter 3, Austin says, leaning forward over his open text. In chapter 2, we think we're just looking at standard debates about picking grain or lowering a guy through a ceiling, but Ezekiel 34 gives us the entire blueprint for what Jesus is doing. Ezekiel talks about Yahweh executing judicial warfare against the bad shepherds who feed themselves but leave the flock broken, scattered, and unhealed. When those 4 guys dug through the mud and thatch roof in Capernaum to drop the paralytic down, the scribes were just sitting there in high-status seats, offering zero pastoral aid, completely focused on corporate theological surveillance. Jesus doesn't just heal the man. He bypasses their entire institutional temple apparatus by forgiving sins directly on a dirt floor, which looks less like a gentle ministry and more like a total demolition of their regional establishment. Tyler scribbles a cross-reference in his margin, nodding eagerly toward Chloe. And the tax booth right after that fits the exact same pattern, Tyler adds, his eyes tracking the structural consistency. The religious elite classified people like Levi as permanently compromised, but Jesus aggressively enters that marginalized space to establish a table fellowship that acts out the divine retrieval of the scattered sheep. But from a historical standpoint, the Pharisees weren't some centralized state monolithic apparatus. They were a regional renewal movement trying to keep the covenant intact under Roman occupation. So when Jesus claims the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, he isn't just fixing bad leadership. He's placing his personal authority completely above the statutory law of Israel. Sarah shifts back into the cushions of the sofa, her brow furrowing as she grips the edge of her Bible. It feels so volatile when you put it that way, because I grew up being taught these stories as simple, isolated moral lessons about Jesus being kind to people who were sick or left out, she says, looking towards Samuel for reassurance. Samuel nods slowly, his voice tight with cognitive dissonance. Yeah, it introduces this crazy social instability that I never noticed before. It makes him look like a radical sectarian leader who is intentionally provoking lethal political alignments. Evelyn adjusts her glasses, her eyes scanning the beginning of chapter 3, where the conflict moves directly into the synagogue. Arthur and I have been reading these verses devotion style for over 30 years, and we completely missed how the tension escalates from internal scribal grumbling to open conspiracy, she says, pointing to the text of verse 6. Jesus commands the man with the shriveled hand to stand up in front of everyone on the Sabbath, and he asks that diagnostic question about whether it's lawful to do good or evil, to save life or to kill. The absolute silence of the onlookers is what breaks him. The text says he looked around at them in anger, deeply distressed by their stubborn hearts. He heals the chronic, non-life-threatening deformity through a simple spoken word, and the Pharisees immediately walk out the door to plot with the pro-Roman Herodians on how to destroy him. Arthur leans over the table, his finger tracing the word destroy. They felt he was an engine of systemic chaos because the Sabbath was the ultimate national identity marker under pagan occupation, and he was dismantling their baseline security to gather the flock on his own terms. Austin turns a page in his notebook, his expression sharpening as he introduces the final verses of the chapter. And that brings us to the absolute heart of the matter, where the structural fracture hits the bedrock of ancient Near Eastern stability. The biological household, Austin says, tapping the verses concerning the family standing outside. My college thesis, The Shame of James, focused entirely on this exact moment where Jesus' mother and brothers, including James, arrive to take charge of him because they think he's out of his mind. The crowd is so dense inside the house that they can't even eat, and the Jerusalem scribes are claiming he's possessed by Beelzebul, which means his family is likely trying to restrain him to save him from an execution or public disgrace. But when they send word inside, Jesus looks at the circle seated around him and completely redefines covenant boundaries based strictly on doing God's will, leaving his biological family standing outside in the courtyard. Chloe leans in closer, her pen hovering over the text as she takes in the emotional weight of the scene. So the Good Shepherd paradigm isn't just about peaceful restoration. It actually demands absolute allegiance above natural filial obligations, Chloe says, looking around the circle. He binds the strong man, plunders the house, and then splits the natural family structure right down the middle to build a new community from the inside out. Samuel stares at the open page, his thumb rubbing the binding as the weight of the disruption settles over the room. It's a terrifying level of authority because he isn't patching up the old system or working within their traditional guardrails. He's standing on that mountain appointing the 12 to completely reconstitute Israel, regardless of the political or relational chaos it causes.